Hi and welcome to this tutorial on Hibernate. This is another one of those important tutorials. I'm going to talk about a concept that's fundamental to Hibernate, so make sure you try out the examples in this tutorial, probably watch the tutorial a couple of times so that you are sure you get the concepts here. The concept that I'm going to talk about in this tutorial is the concept of a transient object and a persistent object. This is something that we've been seeing all along in the tutorials, but without actually realizing it. So we'll spend some time and understand what a transient object is and what a persistent object is. And I'm going to explain these concepts with the best way to explain anything, which is by seeing them in action. So we'll write some code. I have this main method here. This is something that I've been using all along the tutorials. I have a session factory here which reads from a configuration, and I'm opening a session and beginning a transaction, and here at the end of it I'm committing the transaction and closing. So all my Hibernate transaction code will go over here. Now this is a common thing that we did earlier. We had a user details entity class. We had marked it as an entity, and all it does is it just has an ID and a name. The ID has been marked as @ID annotation with a generated value, and the name is just another property. Now we did this in our earlier tutorial, but let's try this again. I will instantiate a user object, and I will set the username. Okay, so now I have my user object here. This is an entity. We have defined this as an entity here. So I'm instantiating a new object of the user details class, and I'm setting a name to it. Now what I would do normally is I would have a session.save of the user here. Okay, so when this line is entered, Hibernate would save this user into the database. So what would happen is it would have a new record in the table for this user. Now this is actually a two-step process. The first step is to instantiate an object, and the second step is to actually pass this object to a session.save. If you do not do this step, then this object is not saved to the database. It's fairly simple because we are not asking Hibernate to save this. Now, without passing an object to a session.save, even though it is an entity object, if we are not passing this to a session.save, this object is said to be what is called as a transient object. That means that this object is not persistent. It's not saved by Hibernate. Hibernate doesn't know that this object has to be saved. So that's a transient object. And now when I use a session.save to save this object, then it becomes a persistent object. When an object is persistent, then Hibernate tracks that object and saves it. Now, what do I mean by track an object? Let's run a couple of tests to find out. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this. I'm going to comment this out, so it's not going to do a session.save. Now what happens if I run this? Okay, before I run this, there's one more change I need to make. I'll go to the hibernate.cfg.xml, and I will mark this as a create. I'm changing the HBM to ddl.auto property as create. So I want the schema to be dropped. Right now, if I run this, it's going to have data of our previous example. So I'm going to remove all of that and create the schema from the scratch. So I'll save this file. Of course, I'll save this. So what we are doing here is we are instantiating a new object of the entity class, but we're not passing it to Hibernate. I'm just beginning a transaction and I'm closing it. Now, if I run this, it is obvious what the result is going to be. There will not be any records. Now, if I do a session.save, of this object that I'm initializing here, and run this, Now it's actually going to insert the value. So I can see a user record available here. Now, the interesting thing that I want to show you is this. Now, I've done a session.save, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the user object here after the session.save. Well, before the session.save is straightforward. Now, if I do a user.set username, say updated user. Okay, now what's the value going to be in the database? Obviously it will be the updated user. Okay, simple enough. Now the question is, what happens if I do this change after the session.save? Now I have a user object here. I have already asked Hibernate to save this, and now after I've asked Hibernate to save this, I am changing one of the properties of the user. Now, will the user in the table, will the value be test user or the updated user? Let's find that out. If I run this, here you see an insert statement and an update statement. What's going on here? Now let's query it. Again, the value is updated user. So what's happening here is that when I do a session.save, Hibernate is doing an insert of this data. It's inserting test user. But then when I change the username of the user object, and I'm not asking Hibernate to save it again. Note that here. I'm not doing anything else here. I'm just changing the property of the user object. But what Hibernate does is it automatically triggers the update so that the value in the database is also reflecting this change. So this opens up a lot of new questions here. Now, how does Hibernate know what change to get reflected in the database? The answer is that once you pass an object, an entity object, to a session.save, after that any change you make to that object will go as an update statement to the database. So whatever changes you make at the end of the program, once you commit the transaction and once you do a session.close, the last state of the user object is what's going to be the state of the database. So you might do 10 different updates here, but then the last update that you're going to do before you commit the transaction and close the session, so that last one is what's going to go into the database. So of course, if you have a different property, then the last update of that property is going to go in. Since I have just one username here, so it's the last update for that username. So what happens is that no matter what change you do here, whatever changes you make, it is going to do the update. Now let's update this one more time. Now I've set the username as updated user. Okay, I'm going to do a set username twice after I've done a session.save. Now, will there be two updates entered? Now, note that there is just one update. So again, but if you look at the database, you see that the last value has been reflected, even though the update has been called only once. How is that happening? How is this update not getting reflected? What's happening is that not every change you make triggers an update query. Now, Hibernate intelligently detects what is the change that needs to go to the database, and then it figures out what is the least number of updates that need to be made. We're going to look at this in a bit more detail, but what's important to understand here is that once you hand over an object to Hibernate and say, hey Hibernate, save this object for me, then Hibernate is going to watch that object for any changes. So no matter what change you make, Hibernate is going to automatically fire update queries so that the row in the database that corresponds to this object is reflecting the changes that you have made in the object. So that is the important difference between a transient object and a persistent object. Before an object is handed over to Hibernate, it is a transient object. Hibernate does not track this object over here. But When I do a session.save, then I'm giving the responsibility to Hibernate to make sure that the object state matches the database state. So no matter what updates I make to this persistent object, it is going to get reflected in the database. So here it's a transient object. Once I hand it over to Hibernate, it becomes a persistent object, and any changes made to the persistent object get reflected in the database. Once I do a session.close, it becomes what's called as a detached object. A detached object is similar to the transient object in the sense that Hibernate is not going to track the changes. And no matter what changes, no matter what updates you make to the object, it is not going to be persisted in the database. But a detached object means that the object was tracked by Hibernate before, it was persisted by Hibernate before, but now that the session has been closed, it is no longer tracked by Hibernate, and now it is in a detached state. A transient state is when it is not even, Hibernate hasn't even looked at that object. So it's a transient. But, once Hibernate takes up that object, it becomes persistent. And once once the session has been closed, the object becomes detached. Now, say I do an update here. I say session.user.setUsername. Now I do this. If I run this, let's see what's the database state. It does not have the update that I've made after the session close. Now this update has not gone through to the database because after the session closes, Hibernate says, okay, my responsibility is done. I have tracked this object as long as the session was open, and I have saved all the data to the database. But then after the session is closed, this user is not Hibernate's responsibility. It becomes a detached object. This is what we need to remember. Transient object before we hand it over to Hibernate. Once we hand it over to Hibernate, once we do a session.save, Hibernate takes the responsibility of tracking the object and making database updates. And once the session is closed, the object becomes a detached object and Hibernate is not going to track the changes. Hope this is clear. We're going to look at a few more, implications of this concept in the next tutorial.